You're not exhausted because you are weak. You're not drained because you lack discipline. You're not burned out because you fail to manage your time. You're burned out because your energy is being extracted, measured, monetized, and sold back to you. You are not tired by accident. You are tired by design. They have told you that fatigue is personal. They have told you that anxiety is individual. They have told you that if you feel empty at the end of the day, it is because you did not optimize yourself enough. But what if your exhaustion is not a flaw in your character, but a symptom of exploitation? What if your burnout is not a medical condition alone, but a social condition born in the very structure of the system under which you labor, dear? Under capitalism, your time is not your own. Your strength is not your own. Even your creativity is not your own. It becomes a commodity. In the marketplace described in Das Kapital, labor power is bought and sold like any other good. You, the living, breathing human being, are reduced to an instrument of production. Your employer purchases your capacity to work, and in return you receive wages barely sufficient to restore you for another day of labor. The difference between what you produce and what you are paid, that is profit. That is surplus value, that is the unpaid portion of your life. And so you feel drained, not because you are lazy, but because your life force is continuously extracted. You are expected to give more, produce more, smile more, endure more, while receiving less security, less ownership, less dignity. The machine demands infinite output from finite human beings. You wake before the sun. You travel through crowded streets. You enter offices, factories, warehouses, digital platforms, and you give your hours to a system that does not belong to you. Your labor builds wealth you will never see. Your effort expands corporations you do not control. Your loyalty strengthens institutions that would replace you without hesitation. They call this freedom of big business. Then what freedom exists when survival depends on selling your labor to those who own the means of production? In the Communist Manifesto, it was written that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Today, that struggle is disguised in modern language, performance reviews, productivity metrics, hustle culture, self-branding. Yet, the essence remains unchanged. One class owns, the other works. Burnout is the psychological expression of alienation. Alienation from the product of your labor, because what you create is not yours. Alienation from the process of labor, because you do not control how or why you work. Alienation from your fellow workers, because you are forced into competition with them. Alienation from your own human potential, because your creativity is confined to what is profitable. You feel empty because your labor has been separated from your humanity. The system whispers, work harder. It never asks who profits from your harder work. It tells you to meditate so you can endure exploitation more calmly. It offers you weekend distractions so you forget the 5 days of submission. It sells you self-care products instead of structural change. This is not accidental. Capitalism survives not only by extracting surplus value, but by shaping consciousness. If you believe your suffering is personal failure, you will not question the structure. If you blame yourself, you will not organize. If you think burnout is weakness, you will not see it as resistance crying out from within you. But you are not alone in this exhaustion. Across factories, offices, farms, delivery routes, hospitals, and digital platforms, millions feel the same depletion. This shared fatigue is not coincidence. It is collective evidence. It is proof of a system that consumes the many to enrich the few. Look upward. Wealth accumulates in unprecedented concentrations. A small minority controls industries, land, technology, and finance. Meanwhile, the majority struggles with rising costs, precarious employment, and shrinking security. Productivity increases, yet wages stagnate. Innovation accelerates, yet leisure diminishes. The worker produces more wealth than ever before and possesses less of it. This contradiction cannot sustain itself forever. You are told that if you are burned out, you should quit quietly, change careers, reinvent yourself. But individual escape does not solve collective exploitation. The problem is not one workplace. It is the system of wage labor itself, a system in which the worker's survival depends on selling labor power to those who own capital. To rail freedom will not come from better time management. It will not come from motivational slogans printed by corporations. It will not come from hoping the powerful develop conscience. It will come from organization when workers recognize that their exhaustion is shared, solidarity begins. When they understand that profit depends entirely on their labor power shifts. The capitalist may own the factory, but without workers, the factory is silent. The investor may own the platform, but without drivers, coders, and creators, it produces nothing. You are not powerless. You are essential. Imagine a society in which the producers collectively own the means of production, where labor is organized not for private profit but for human need, where technology reduces work hours instead of intensifying them, where education cultivates potential rather than preparing obedience, where rest is not a privilege purchased through overwork, but a right of being human. This is not fantasy. It is the logical extension of recognizing who truly creates wealth. The ruling class fears not your fatigue. It depends on it. What it fears is your clarity. It fears class consciousness. It fears the moment when workers cease blaming themselves and begin questioning ownership. It fears unity more than any economic crisis. You are not burned out. You are awakening. Your exhaustion is a signal that something is wrong not within you, but around you. It is the body and mind refusing endless extraction. It is humanity resisting commodification. Do not numb it. Understand it. Transform isolation into solidarity. Transform frustration into organization. Transform burnout into a demand for systemic change. History moves when the oppressed recognize their collective strength. The chains of exploitation are strongest when invisible. The moment you see them, they begin to weaken. You are not weak. You are overused. You are not incapable. You are exploited. And when the working class understands that its exhaustion is the result of theft, the theft of time, value, and dignity, it will no longer ask for relief within the system. It will demand transformation of the system itself. Burnout is often spoken of as a personal failing, a weakness of character, or a lack of discipline, but these explanations are fundamentally misleading. To understand burnout in its true dimension, one must examine the social and economic structures within which labor occurs. Under capitalism, work is not merely a means of personal development or a vehicle for self-fulfillment. It is a mechanism for extracting surplus value from the laboring class. The exhaustion that individuals feel is not a consequence of their inability to manage time, balance priorities, or cultivate resilience. Rather, it is the direct result of a system that demands more from workers than it compensates. A system that thrives on the extraction of human energy, attention, and creativity, while leaving the worker depleted and disempowered. Every hour of labor performed, every idea executed, every task completed contributes to the accumulation of wealth for those who own the means of production. The wages received by the worker are only a fraction of the value produced, intentionally insufficient to grant independence or security, while the remaining surplus is retained by capitalists. This imbalance is not accidental. It is structural. It is embedded in the laws of profit, productivity, and accumulation, creating conditions under which exhaustion is inevitable. The worker's fatigue is not an individual anomaly, but a collective reality, felt by millions across industries, geographies, and sectors, revealing the systemic nature of the phenomenon. Moreover, burnout cannot be understood solely in physical or psychological terms, because it is intimately tied to alienation. Under capitalism, workers are alienated from the product of their labor because they do not own it. They are alienated from the process of labor because the terms and pace of work are dictated by external forces. They are alienated from themselves because the conditions of work reduce human potential to measurable output. The experience of exhaustion is therefore both material and existential. It is the body registering the overextension imposed by a system that treats time, energy, and creativity as commodities. The system cultivates a culture in which workers internalize blame for their fatigue, turning personal introspection into a tool for maintaining exploitation. Productivity guides, self-help manuals, wellness apps, and motivational rhetoric are sold to workers as remedies, but these are merely distractions from the structural roots of the problem. They provide temporary relief without challenging the conditions that generate exhaustion. The capitalist framework thrives on this misdirection, because a worker who believes their fatigue is personal is less likely to question the system or demand change. Meanwhile, the demands placed upon labor continue to escalate. Technology is deployed not to liberate but to intensify output, to make each worker accountable to metrics, deadlines, and constant performance evaluation. Job insecurity pressures workers to overextend themselves, knowing that refusal or resistance may result in replacement. Globalization and competitive labor markets exacerbate this pressure, creating the illusion that exhaustion is an individual problem rather than a shared systemic condition. Mental health narratives, while important, are often co-opted to frame burnout as a private concern. Counseling, mindfulness, and stress reduction programs are promoted as solutions, yet they do not address the economic and social mechanisms that produce exhaustion. The structural conditions remain untouched. Long hours, precarious employment, inadequate compensation, and the constant extraction of surplus value. Recognizing burnout as systemic exploitation shifts the focus from self-blame to collective understanding. It illuminates the way power operates through labor, how energy and time are commodified, and how human capacity is harnessed to enrich a minority while the majority is drained. It calls for awareness of the inequities inherent in capitalist production, where the laborer is compelled to give more than they receive, and where profit is prioritized over human well-being. Understanding his systemic dynamic transforms the narrative. Exhaustion becomes a signal, a marker of injustice, an indication that the structures governing work and life are misaligned with human needs. It becomes a call to analyze and challenge the mechanisms that produce inequity and depletion, to connect personal experience with collective reality, and to recognize that individual strategies for coping are insufficient when the roots of exhaustion lie in exploitation. By framing burnout as a social condition rather than a personal flaw, workers can begin to articulate the ways in which labor, compensation, and power are intertwined. They can see that fatigue is a symptom of a broader system that extracts life itself from those who sustain it. The awareness that one is being used rather than failing is the first step toward resisting the forces that demand endless output. It is the beginning of a recognition that labor has value beyond what is purchased in wages. that human capacity is appropriated for profit, and that systemic change is required to restore balance between work, life, beyond, and dignity. In this framework, burnout is no longer a private struggle to be overcome through self-management or endurance. It becomes evidence of exploitation, a tangible manifestation of economic structures that prioritize accumulation over human well-being, and a clarion call to collective consciousness, solidarity, and action. Under capitalism, labor is not merely a process of producing goods or services. It is a mechanism through which value is extracted from the worker for the benefit of those who own the means of production. The concept of surplus value, articulated by Marx in Das Kapital, is central to understanding this extraction. Every worker, in the course of performing their labor, produces more value than they receive in wages. The portion of their work that exceeds what is compensated is appropriated by the capitalist as profit. This is not an occasional occurrence or an unfair business practice. It is the fundamental law of the capitalist system. The worker's energy, skill, and creativity are transformed into commodities whose value benefits someone other than the laborer who created them. From the very first hour of work, a portion of human effort is claimed by the employer without corresponding remuneration, creating a structural inequality that is embedded into the fabric of society. This extraction is not limited to financial gain. It reaches deeply into the worker's sense of self and experience of life. Alienation occurs at multiple levels. Workers are alienated from the product of their labor because the goods or services they create are not theirs. They have no ownership over what they produce, and often little influence over its design, purpose, or distribution. Instead of expressing creativity, skill, and intelligence in a way that satisfies personal or social need, their labor becomes a vehicle for profit accumulation disconnected from the worker's intentions or desires. This alienation extends to the labor process itself. Workers are compelled to follow the dictates of efficiency, deadlines, and managerial control. The process of work is no longer an expression of human capability or craftsmanship. It becomes an external obligation imposed by the logic of capital. Every decision, every movement, every hour of effort is subordinated to productivity targets and profit margins. This control strips labor of autonomy and transforms work into a form of coercion disguised as employment. The alienation is also social. Capitalism encourages competition among workers, pitting one against another for jobs, promotions, and recognition, undermining solidarity and shared interests. Collective bonds which could empower laborers to resist, exploitation are weakened as individuals navigate a system structured to reward compliance and productivity rather than cooperation and communal well-being. The alienation reaches into the core of human existence. The worker is alienated from their own humanity because the capitalist system measures their worth in terms of productivity and profitability rather than capacity for thought, creativity, and social connection. Human labor, which could be a source of fulfillment and self-expression, is instead commodified, converted into a means to sustain the capitalist structure rather than to nurture the worker. Even the rhythms of life are dominated by this extraction. Work hours, rest, leisure, and personal development are all subordinated to the demands of capital. Workers often find themselves exhausted, stressed, and disconnected from their own needs, experiencing a life that is largely dictated by the external imperatives of profit rather than by personal or communal fulfillment. Moreover, this extraction perpetuates systemic inequality. Those who own capital accumulate wealth far beyond what their labor could generate, while workers receive only a fraction of the value they produce. This imbalance is maintained through institutional structures, legal frameworks and social norms that legitimize the appropriation of surplus value and normalize the alienation of labor. Education, training, and social narratives often reinforce the idea that laborers are responsible for their position in the system, masking the structural mechanisms that exploit them. The extraction of surplus value is not a static phenomenon. It evolves with technology, markets, and global capitalism. Automation, digital platforms, and the gig economy intensify the appropriation of human effort while increasing precarity, making workers more dependent on selling their labor under conditions that are often unpredictable, insecure, and unsustainable. This intensification further alienates labor from its products, process, social connection, and humanity. Recognizing this dynamic is crucial for understanding not just economic inequality, but the lived experience of millions of workers. Alienation under capitalism is not a matter of individual failure or lack of resilience. It is a systemic condition that shapes consciousness, limits freedom, and extracts human potential. The exhaustion, stress, and sense of disconnection that workers experience are not accidental. They are the inevitable outcomes of a system built on the separation of labor from ownership, creativity from purpose, and humanity from the means of production. Awareness of this alienation is the first step toward challenging it, toward building solidarity, and toward envisioning a system in which labor is not exploited but valued in ways that nourish human potential rather than deplete it. The recognition that every hour worked produces more than is returned to the worker exposes the fundamental injustice of capitalist production, revealing the need for a transformation of social relations in which labor serves human needs rather than the accumulation of private wealth, and in which workers are reunited with the products, process, community, and humanity that have been denied to them under the current system. Too often, people are led to believe that the solution to their suffering under capitalism lies in individual effort, a change in habits, a shift in mindset, or the pursuit of personal self-improvement. Books on productivity, courses on mindfulness, apps on time management, and social media exhortations all promise that if one works harder, relaxes smarter, or organizes life more efficiently, the weight of exploitation can be alleviated. Yet these remedies address only symptoms, not causes. Structural oppression is not the result of personal failure. It is built into the very foundations of economic and social systems. It is codified in laws, enforced through institutions, and perpetuated by cultural narratives that legitimize inequality. No matter how disciplined an individual becomes, no matter how clever or resilient, the system will continue to extract surplus value, commodify labor, and concentrate wealth in the hands of the few. Individual strategies, while sometimes useful for temporary relief, cannot dismantle the mechanisms that perpetuate exploitation. When a worker organizes their time perfectly, or cultivates mental resilience, they may endure their oppression more comfortably, but they have not altered the fundamental relationship between labor and capital. The conditions that produce long hours, low wages, insecure employment, and alienation remain untouched. The structural forces that require the majority to labor for the enrichment of a minority are indifferent to individual triumphs. Individual action in the context of systemic oppression risks being co-opted, neutralized, or rendered irrelevant. It is only through collective organization that the imbalance of power can be addressed. When workers come together, share knowledge, and unite around common interests, they can transform dispersed grievances into a coherent challenge to exploitation. Solidarity creates leverage. A single worker demanding fair treatment may be ignored, replaced, or marginalized. But a collective acting in unison wields power over production itself, over the flow of labor, and ultimately over the accumulation of wealth. This is the lesson repeated throughout the history of labor movements. Unions, strikes, cooperative ventures, and popular uprisings have succeeded not because of individual brilliance, but because of shared purpose and coordinated action. Collective organization transforms private suffering into political and economic force. It allows workers to identify the systemic nature of their oppression, connecting personal experiences of fatigue, underpayment, or insecurity to broader patterns of exploitation. Through this recognition, the isolated and powerless become part of a larger social force capable of demanding change. Capitalism, in its relentless pursuit of profit, depends on the fragmentation and isolation of workers. By encouraging competition, internalized blame, and individualized coping strategies, the system maintains its dominance. The capitalist structure relies on the idea that each worker is solely responsible for their success or failure, masking the social conditions that limit opportunity and extract labor. Only when individuals move beyond isolation, recognizing that their struggles are shared, can this false narrative be disrupted. Collective organization also enables workers to envision alternatives to the existing system. It is not enough to demand incremental improvements in wages or working conditions. True transformation requires coordinated action that challenges the distribution of power and ownership itself. Through organization, laborers can assert the principle that the wealth they create belongs not to a distant capitalist, but to the collective body of workers whose effort sustains society. Organization is also a form of defense against exploitation. The more dispersed and isolated individuals are, the more easily they can be replaced, ignored, or intimidated. United, workers possess the capacity to resist coercion, enforce rights, and negotiate conditions that reflect their actual contribution to production. Furthermore, collective action fosters consciousness and awareness. Through shared struggle, individuals begin to understand the structures of oppression that shape their lives. Moving F. Rome, the perception of personal failure to recognition of systemic injustice. This awareness fuels strategy, solidarity, and sustained effort, enabling movements that challenge inequity in ways that individual initiative alone never could. Individual solutions, while often framed as empowerment, may inadvertently reinforce structural oppression by diverting attention from systemic change. They may pacify unrest, offering the illusion of control, while the underlying mechanisms of exploitation continue unabated. Only through coordinated, collective organization can the entrenched hierarchies of capitalism, patriarchy, racial oppression, and economic inequality be confronted effectively. History demonstrates that significant social, political, and economic reform is rarely achieved by isolated actors. It is achieved when people recognize their shared conditions, unite in common purpose, and act with coordination and strategy. Organization allows the powerless to wield power collectively, transforming systemic oppression into a battlefield where collective strength can contest entrenched privilege and ownership. Without such organization, individuals remain vulnerable, overburdened and isolated, perpetually subject to the whims of the system that exploits them. Collective action, in contrast, shifts the balance, giving workers the capacity to assert their interests, reclaim what is extracted from them, and begin the process of structural transformation. It is not a matter of goodwill or moral persuasion. It is a matter of aligning the forces of labor against the forces of capital, creating the conditions under which genuine change, redistribution of power, creating the conditions under which genuine change, redistribution of power, and liberation from systemic oppression can occur. Solidarity among workers is not a mere sentiment or a feel-good notion. It is the foundation upon which power can be reclaimed and wealth redistributed. Under capitalism, labor is the source of all value, yet the fruits of that labor are systematically appropriated by those who own the means of production. The worker creates wealth through skill, effort, and ingenuity, yet the benefits of this creation are concentrated in the hands of a minority, while the majority subsists on wages that rarely reflect the true value of their work. This separation of creation from ownership is the essence of exploitation, and it is maintained through division, competition, and alienation. The system thrives when workers see themselves as isolated individuals, competing against one another for limited opportunities, promotions, and recognition. In this environment, the energy that could be used to challenge the system is dissipated in self-preservation and rivalry. Solidarity is the antidote to this division. When workers recognize their shared interests and unite across industries, trades, and roles, they create a collective force that cannot be ignored. The simple truth is that production depends entirely on labor. Without the workers, factories lie idle, offices cease to function, transportation grinds to a halt, and services collapse. The capitalist may control property, machinery, or capital, but without the cooperation of the laboring majority, those assets produce nothing. Solidarity transforms isolated vulnerability into collective leverage. When workers act in concert, they gain the ability to negotiate not merely for fair wages or safer conditions, but for influence over the distribution of wealth they generate. Strikes, unionization, cooperative ownership, and coordinated demands become expressions of power precisely because they harness the collective weight of labor. Each worker, by acting alone, possesses limited influence. Together they constitute an unassailable force capable of reshaping economic relations. Beyond the immediate economic implications, solidarity fosters consciousness. Through shared struggle, workers come to understand that their exhaustion, low pay, and insecurity are not personal failings, but the result of structural exploitation. Awareness of this reality nurtures a political and social intelligence that is critical to challenging entrenched power. It illuminates the mechanisms by which capital sustains itself, the ways in which wealth is concentrated, and the tactics used to divide and pacify labor. This consciousness, cultivated collectively, is itself a form of power, allowing workers to act strategically rather than reactively, and to challenge oppression on systemic grounds rather than through isolated complaint. Solidarity also enables mutual support. In environments where labor is exploited, fatigue, stress, and alienation are pervasive. The emotional and practical support that emerges from unity helps workers withstand pressures, resist intimidation, and sustain movements over time. In historical contexts, solidarity has been the decisive factor in achieving significant gains. Labor unions have secured rights to fair wages, regulated hours, and safer conditions. Cooperative ventures have allowed workers to reclaim control over production. Social movements rooted in labor solidarity have challenged political structures and forced redistribution of resources. The power of solidarity lies not only in what it can achieve immediately, but in its potential to transform social relations. When workers unite, they assert the principle that those who produce value should have a say in how it is allocated. This challenges the logic of capitalist accumulation, where ownership of capital confers rights to profit, effective contribution. Solidarity democratizes the workplace, empowers laborers to make collective decisions, and begins to dismantle hierarchical structures that concentrate power and wealth in the hands of a few. Furthermore, solidarity bridges divisions of skill, status, ethnicity, and geography. Capitalism often relies on these divisions to fragment labor and weaken collective action. By recognizing common interests, workers can transcend superficial differences, aligning their efforts toward shared goals. This alignment magnifies their influence, transforming the laboring majority into a force capable of asserting control over production and the distribution of wealth. Solidarity is also a moral and ethical imperative, a recognition that justice in the workplace and society cannot be achieved through isolated action. The individual cannot alone secure fair treatment, equitable compensation, or respect for human dignity. Only through collective commitment can these objectives be realized. It turns personal struggle into shared purpose, suffering into strategy, and exploitation into a rallying point for coordinated resistance. Ultimately, solidarity is the mechanism through which the working class can reclaim what has been taken from it. It converts the collective labor that sustains society into leverage against the structures that extract and concentrate wealth. By organizing together, by understanding that their interests are inseparable, and by acting in unison, workers possess the means to challenge entrenched power, assert control over production, and demand that the value they generate benefits those who create it, rather than those who merely own. In this sense, solidarity is not optional, it is essential. It is the bridge between exploitation and empowerment, between alienation and agency, and between the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few and the equitable distribution of resources among those who labor to produce it. Solidarity allows workers to convert collective consciousness into tangible power, to unite scattered strength into decisive action, and to assert ownership over the wealth that is rightfully theirs, transforming the laboring majority from passive participants in their own exploitation into active architects of social and economic justice. True liberation cannot be achieved within the confines of a system that measures human worth by productivity and success by accumulation. Under capitalism, ownership of the means of production is concentrated in the hands of a small minority, and the vast majority are compelled to sell their labor in order to survive. This system ensures that the products of human creativity, skill, and effort are controlled not by those who create them, but by those who hold capital. The profits generated by collective labor flow to a few, while the workers who produce them receive only a fraction of their true value in wages. In this context, freedom is illusory. Workers may have nominal choices of employment or consumer goods, but they lack control over the conditions of their work, the purpose of production, and the distribution of wealth they generate. True liberation, therefore, demands a radical transformation. The structures of ownership and production must be reorganized to prioritize human needs rather than the accumulation of profit. When production is subordinated to the interests of capital, human life becomes a means to an end. Workers are reduced to instruments for wealth generation, and society is organized to maximize output, efficiency, and consumption without regard for the well-being of its members. Labor becomes alienating because the workers' creativity and effort serve an external logic rather than human development. Work is often monotonous, control-led, and disconnected from the satisfaction of social needs and the products of labor benefit those who are removed from the act of creation. The profit motive dictates what is produced, how it is produced, and for whom it is produced, ensuring that essential needs are frequently neglected if they are not profitable. Healthcare, education, Housing and public services, though vital for human flourishing, are often commodified, restricted, or inadequately provided because they do not guarantee maximum return on investment. Under these conditions, society perpetuates inequality, scarcity, and exploitation. True liberation, by contrast, envisions a system in which production is oriented towards satisfying genuine human needs. Food, shelter, education, healthcare, and opportunities for creativity and self-expression are produced and distributed according to collective necessity rather than market demand. The measure of production is no longer profit, but well-being. The aim is not accumulation for a few, but fulfillment for all. Such a transformation requires rethinking ownership itself. Capital, land, technology, and infrastructure must be collectively owned or democratically controlled, so that decisions about production are made in the interest of society rather than private gain. When ownership is decentralized and accountable to the collective, the surplus generated by labor can be reinvested in social development, environmental sustainability, and human empowerment, rather than being siphoned off to reinforce privilege and maintain inequality. Moreover, true liberation entails a transformation of the labor process. Work must become meaningful, self-directed, and aligned with the creative and social capacities of human beings. Automation and technology should reduce drudgery, redistribute labor, and increase leisure rather than intensify exploitation. Decisions above. What is produced and how are taken collectively, incorporating the voices of those who carry out the labor and those who benefit from its results. By reshaping production in this way, labor ceases to be alienating and becomes a source of fulfillment and social contribution. This approach also addresses the ethical dimension of production. When human needs guide the use of resources, society must confront issues of environmental stewardship. Society must confront issues of environmental distribution. The drive for profit under capitalism often encourages overproduction, waste, and environmental degradation. Under a system oriented toward human welfare, production must account for long-term consequences, prioritize sustainability, and ensure that economic activity does not compromise the health and future of communities or the planet. Transformation of ownership and production is not merely a matter of economic restructuring. It is a moral imperative. It requires a shift in values from prioritizing accumulation and competition to prioritizing cooperation, social well-being, and dignity. It recognizes that wealth is created by labor, that society's resources belong to all, and that the purpose of production is to enhance life rather than abstract capital. This vision also demands political and organizational structures capable of sustaining collective decision-making and accountability. Institutions must empower workers, communities, and citizens to participate in shaping the allocation of resources, the direction of production, and the management of social and environmental priorities. Without such structures, even well-intentioned changes may be co-opted or reversed. The path to true liberation, therefore, involves more than reforms within existing frameworks. It requires a fundamental reorientation of social, economic, and political relations. It recognizes that human potential can only be realized when the fruits of labor are equitably shared, when work serves people rather than profit, and when ownership and production are aligned with collective need rather than private gain. It envisions a society in which human development, creativity, and well-being are the guiding principles, where inequality is reduced and where the energy and ingenuity of society are harnessed for the benefit of all. Such a transformation challenges entrenched power, confronts systemic exploitation, and asserts the principle that those who produce the wealth of society should determine its use. It is the necessary foundation for freedom, dignity, and justice, providing a framework in which human life is valued above accumulation and where social, economic, and environmental priorities reflect the needs of the many rather than the profit of the few. The exhaustion, alienation, and exploitation that workers experience under capitalism are not personal failings. They are the inevitable consequences of a system built to extract surplus value and concentrate wealth in the hands of a few. Burnout is evidence of systemic oppression, and no amount of individual effort can overturn the structures that commodify labor and dehumanize life. True liberation arises when workers recognize their shared conditions, embrace solidarity, and organize collectively to challenge the forces that exploit them. Only by uniting can they reclaim the power and wealth they produce, transforming ownership and production to serve human needs rather than profit. Freedom, dignity, and justice demand nothing less than a fundamental restructuring of society, one in which labor is valued, creativity is honored, and the collective well-being of humanity becomes the guiding principle of production and social organization.